I'm gonna be real with you guys. Sometimes I forget that men scientists even exist. Can you wonder why? I think at this point, I can name more women scientists than I can men scientists. I don't know if that's a problem. I don't know if that's opposite of a problem. Meh, whatever. But today I figured we should actually talk about a man scientist because men scientists are cool too. And we're going to talk about one that I think almost everybody has heard their name, had to learn about him at some point, but may not actually know a lot more about him than his name and the one thing in science he's known for. And we're going to talk about Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics. And like I said, we all had to learn about him in school, but how much do we really know about him and his life? Let's find out! Gregor Mendel was born in 1822 in what was then part of the Austrian Empire, but is what is now today the modern-day Czech Republic, and he was born to a family of very, very poor farmers. Gregor Mendel did not want to be a poor farmer. He wanted to get educated, and so he did whatever it took to get money to go to school. Even at one point, his sister gave him part of her own family inheritance, like the family estate, so that he could continue to go to school. And this is in part why Mendel actually ended up becoming a monk, because he could get the religious institution to pay for his education, and he wouldn't have to pay it for himself, which he couldn't do because he didn't have any money. Despite the fact that all Gregor Mendel really wanted to do was go to school and learn about things, he was kind of really bad at school. Not bad at learning things, but bad at taking tests. And he would suffer from several stress-induced illnesses throughout his educational period, including oftentimes anytime he had to take a test. And in fact, he kept failing his tests that he never became a fully certified teacher because he kept failing his certification exams. To me, this sounds a lot like test anxiety, which a lot of people struggle with today. So if you struggle with test anxiety or don't test well, that doesn't mean you're stupid. Gregor Mendel is a genius, and we know him in science forever and ever, and he had the same problem. This is one of the things I really like about learning about scientists and their actual personal lives is it's really easy to learn about them in class and be like, yeah, he was a genius and he did this and he must have been really good at school. That's honestly not the case for a lot of them. They weren't great at school, and I know Rosalind Franklin suffered from test anxiety. Albert Einstein didn't talk until he was in his a little bit older as a kid, and Gregor Mendel kept failing exams. But that didn't stop him from becoming a great scientist. So he never became a fully certified teacher, but nonetheless, he persisted. Gregor Mendel was very curious about the idea of inheritance, not money from your deceased relatives, but what you inherit from your parents trait-wise, or your heredity. At the time, people were kind of aware that, hey, that person kind of looked like their parents and kind of like their siblings, and people tend to kind of look like their family members to a certain extent. But they didn't really know why. They didn't know what was causing it, how it worked. They just kind of could tell based on physical observations. In addition to that, they also thought that you inherited kind of a blend of your parents' traits. So let's say one of your parents had black hair, one of them had blonde hair, you'd end up with brown hair, or whatever, I guess the intermediary between black and blonde would be. And that's called blended inheritance. So these were kind of the pre-existing ideas at the time. Nobody knew what DNA was, no one knew what a gene was. They were just you kind of look like your parent, you got a blended mixture of their traits. Cool. And Gregor Mendel really wanted to study this further and figure out what was going on. So he did his famous pea plant experiments. And he grew pea plants and observed them for 8 years. That's a lot of dedication. I don't think I have that type of dedication to grow plants and observe them for 8 years. He did these experiments from 1856 to 1863, and within them he created generations and generations and generations of pea plants. For the first 2 years of his experiments, Gregor Mendel just let his pea plants, that's hard to say, self-fertilize. So they were just, the parents of each new baby pea plant were exactly the same. Mom and dad were like twins, basically, except it's less weird because it's the plant world, and plant reproduction is not in any way, shape, or form comparable to human reproduction. Anyhow, so as these plants self-fertilized, Gregor Mendel was creating what would be known as purebred, or in nowadays terms, homozygous plants. These plants had all the exact same genetics, so parent, child, or whatever, exact same traits over time. And he isolated certain traits or characteristics of the pea plant, such as how tall or short they were, if they had green or yellow peas, if they had wrinkled or smooth pea pods, etc., etc. Different traits that he could say, after each generation, this pea plant is exactly the same as its parent. So now that he knew that their genetics, or he didn't even know it was their genetics, now that he knew that their traits were going to give him the exact same thing every single time, he crossed his pea plants with another pea plant. So now instead of doing self-fertilization or self-pollination, he's doing cross-pollination. So, for example, he took a tall pea plant that he knew would always produce tall children, and he took a short pea plant that would always produce short peas, and he bred them together. And what happened? Did he create a bunch of medium-sized pea plants, as so many people thought he would? No! I don't know what that was. No, he ended up with all tall pea plants. Weird. That doesn't support blended inheritance that everybody thought was going to go on. And what happened to any of that short pea plant information? Did it go somewhere? What happened? Gregor Mendel was like, I wonder if I keep breeding these new plants that are all tall, but their parents were short at some point, will I eventually get a short pea plant? So he allowed the new hybrid pea plant to self-pollinate, and lo and behold, he ended up getting short pea plants. But he got short pea plants at a much smaller amount than he did tall pea plants. And in fact, he ended up with, for every approximately 4 pea plants, 3 of them were tall, 1 of them was short. And if we remember our Punnett squares, we can easily visualize this. Also, I found out that Punnett squares were invented by a man named Reginald Punnett. And this was like 50 to 60 years after Gregor Mendel's work, and he invented the Punnett square in order to easily visualize the distribution of different types of traits. So, let's take a look at our Punnett square real quick. If we have 2 parents that are kind of hybrids, so they have shortness in them, each one of them has a copy of 2 different traits. So in this case, we have height. So we have a big H for being tall and a little h for being short, a big H for being tall and a little h for being short, and we cross them together. Any place that has a big H is going to be tall. Any place that it's got 2 double H's is going to be short. And bam, 3-to-1 ratio. Gregor noticed that some of the traits would overshadow others. So the tallness was overshadowing the short trait. So he called these traits dominant, and the other ones that didn't pop up as much recessive. And because of this, you needed to have full purebred recessive plant in order for that recessive characteristic to show up. I mean, pretty gosh dang genius of him to figure out all of this stuff just by looking at pea plants. And honestly, he got pretty lucky studying pea plants, because a lot of other traits tend to be a lot more complicated than simple Mendelian genetics sets forth. Things that will be linked to like X or Y chromosomes or controlled by multiple genes on a genome, etc. But the pea plants were actually fairly straightforward. But Gregor Mendel decided to take this one step further and therefore more complicated. And he took pea plants that would maybe be tall and have green peas and bred them with pea plants that were short with yellow peas and tried to see what would happen with 2 different traits coinciding with one another. And that creates a gigantic Punnett square that is, I had to remind myself how to do these because I don't remember how to do them. And he ended up getting also, again, the dominant, so plants that would have both of the dominant traits at about 9 out of 16 of his plants. Plants that would have 1 dominant and 1 recessive trait, 3 of them. Plants that would have the recessive trait and then the dominant trait, 3 of those also, and then 1 plant out of 16 approximately that would have both of the recessive traits. And he did this over and over and over again, developed all of these, found a very consistent mathematical pattern, and was like, man, am I onto something? And he was. So he wrote up all of his stuff, published it in 1865, and nobody read it. or almost nobody read it. I'm sure a couple people read it, but it didn't have the immediate long-lasting impact that would make eventually every single student in school, at least in the United States and probably elsewhere, have to learn about him. That would take another 50 to 60 years before his work would kind of get rediscovered and would be like, oh my gosh, this man was really onto something. And eventually he would become famous, people knew his work, and then father of Mendelian genetics. And nowadays, of course, we know like about DNA and how it contains all the information of genetics and genes and stuff like that. We've mapped the human genome. I mean, there's still a lot we don't know about genes and how everything connects, but we know way more than Gregor Mendel did at the time of his pea plant experiments. One of the most interesting things I actually think is the fact that kind of parallel to Gregor Mendel running these experiments in a monastery in Austria is the publication of Charles Darwin's work on his theory of evolution. So on the origin of species and other publications he put forth kind of happened around the same time that Mendel was doing his experiments. And Gregor Mendel actually read a lot of Charles Darwin's work, and this even further piqued his curiosity about heredity. But I kind of wish Charles Darwin had been able to read Mendel's work, because one of the central tenets to the theory of evolution put forth by Darwin is the fact that offspring inherit their parents' traits. That's how natural selection works, is if traits do not get inherited, then there's nothing for nature to select for or against. So basically, Darwin was saying offsprings inherit their parents' traits, but he had absolutely no idea kind of how that worked, and Mendel was over here doing his work on pea plants and offering that explanation for how offspring inherit their parents' traits. So it would have been really interesting, in alternative science history, if the two had been more aware of one another and been able to really bounce back and forth ideas and stuff like that, because genetics and heredity are so key to helping explain the theory of evolution. Anyway, my wishes for scientific alternate history. Towards the end of his life, Gregor Mendel actually became an abbot of the monastery and then kind of fell away from his experiments and got really, bitterly embroiled in a political dispute about paying taxes, etc. And kind of isolated himself from a lot of his friends. And nobody really liked him towards the end of his life. And again, none of his work got noticed really during his life. But I feel like these stories always end like this. I'm so sorry. They're always kind of a downer. Nobody got recognition in their lives. The ideas that Mendel wrote about and studied in his pea plants became fundamental to understanding how traits got passed down from parent to child, and a little bit about how dominant and recessive genes work. So why you might see the same trait pop up over and over again in a family or in a pea plant, and then every once in a while you have somebody that's looks completely different and you're like, where did they come from? But they're still blood related, because genetics be wild. So, with that, thank you, Gregor Mendel, for your very meticulous work involving the pea plant. That takes dedication, my man. And I just thought that was a little fun story to tell today. Hope you all enjoyed this video. Please like this channel. Please subscribe to this channel, like this video, tell your friends about it, and as always, keep it sciencey!